Good afternoon. Welcome to today's event, Crucial Partners, a conversation on the future of US-India relations. I'm Dr. Kerstin Hamann. I'm the Interim Director of the India Center at UCF and also a Pegasus Professor in the School of Politics, Security, and International Affairs. The India Center at UCF broadens the awareness and understanding of contemporary India. And the India Center promotes the study of India's role in the world today through partnerships, scholarship, research, education, and outreach to the Indian community in Florida and nationally. Today's event is timely and highly pertinent to understanding India today, as it focuses on the important relationship between the United States and India. I will leave commentary about the significance of this relationship to our distinguished speaker, Dr. Milan Vaishnav from the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Welcome again, and it is now my pleasure to turn this over to Laila Chacko, the Director of Public Affairs of the India Center. Laila?
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce our speakers this afternoon. But before I introduce them, I would like to announce that today's session is being recorded for our website. Also, we're going to have 10 minutes at the end of the session for questions for the speakers. So please use the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen so the questions will go to the moderator. First, I'd like to introduce Dr. Nikola Mirilovic, who will be leading today's discussion as the moderator. Nikola is an associate professor in the School of Politics, Security, and International Affairs at the University of Central Florida. And he's also an affiliate faculty member for the India Center. Nikola's research examines links between domestic and international politics, and his research interests include migration and diaspora politics, and the study of the role of ideology and religion in international relations. He's the co-editor of the Handbook on Migration and Social Policy. And Dr. Milan Vaishnav is Director and Senior Fellow of the South Asia Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He conducts research on the political economy of India. He's the host of the podcast Grand Tamasha, which focuses on Indian politics and policy. And he's the author of When Crime Pays, Money and Muscle in Indian Politics, and co-editor of Costs of Democracy, Political Finance in India. Now, please join me in giving a virtual warm welcome to Nikola and Milan.
So Dr. Vaishnav, thank you for participating in this event today, and thank you for joining us. I'm looking forward to having this conversation with you.
Thanks so much for inviting me, and thanks to UCF for putting this together.
Okay, so let us begin. So the first question I wanted to ask you is, as has been pointed out in the promotion of this event, there is a quote from then Senator Biden from 2006 about how by 2020, the US and India would be among the closest nations in the world. So what do you think about this prediction? Has it come true? In what ways has it come true? In what ways it has not?
It's a great question. And I do think it's actually pretty true. You know, the United States and India have had a very long and complicated history with one another. And it really wasn't until the late 1990s and the year 2000 and after that the two really began a kind of new era in their relationship of developing a strategic partnership. During the Cold War, India first started out as being non-aligned, didn't want to sign up either to the Western Bloc or the Eastern Bloc. Starting from the 1970s onwards, became much closer to the then Soviet Union, the United States. So there was this kind of frosty history between the two. Things certainly changed in the late 1990s on account of, the collapse of communism and the fall of the Soviet Union, India's own embrace of economic globalization, and just, I think, the strategic dynamics of kind of geopolitics really changed. There has been a bipartisan bet in Washington made both by Democrats and Republicans that investing in India is good for America's future. I think that relationship is built on a couple of pillars or assumptions. The first is obviously, India is a country of 1.3 billion people. It represents in some sense a kind of marketplace for the future, right? If you're looking at new trade, investment, export opportunities, India is typically atop most people's lists. Number two is that the U.S. is entering a new period of strategic competition with China. And I think policymakers from both the Democratic and Republican Party have placed a strategic bet on India as essentially being a democratic countervailing force that can provide an alternative center of gravity in the Asia Pacific that represents a model that those of us in the United States would like to see triumph over the authoritarian Chinese communist model. And I think the third is, and I know we're going to get to this later, is the United States has been on the receiving end of just an explosive growth of migrants from India to this country. So there are around 4 million people of Indian origin who reside in the United States today. Now, you could say, well, that's only about 1% of the population. That's not that big. But the pace of that growth is really worth pointing out. Between the years 2000 and 2018, the Indian American population has grown by 150%. 2/3 of the people of Indian origin who reside in the United States came after the year 2000, right? So this is really phenomenal growth. And I think for all of these reasons, geopolitics, economics, people-to-people ties, migration, this prediction that Biden made has actually come to fruition.
Okay, so you brought up several interesting factors here that I would like to follow up on. And so we can actually start by talking about the diaspora factor and the Indian American community. So you and your co-authors have done some very interesting research recently analyzing survey data on political attitudes of Indian Americans. And as you correctly point out, the Indian American community is growing. People of Indian origin are among the largest immigrant groups in this country. And yet there hasn't been much research analyzing systematically their political views in particular. And you and your co-authors are now doing this, and that's making a valuable contribution, and it is much needed. So based on your research and your findings, what can you tell us about the likely impact that the Indian American community may have on US-India ties? And let me highlight a couple of findings of your research in particular. One is that you find that Indian Americans tend to express an interest in stronger US-India ties. On the other hand, you also have the finding that this is not one of the key bases of their vote in the 2020 elections in the United States. So what then would be the net effect, and what do you think is the overall influence potentially of the Indian American community on US-India ties?
Yeah, it's a great question. There has been research done, survey-based research on the Asian American community, and in fact, we're seeing more and more in that with each passing year. What we wanted to do is to look at one subcomponent of that group, the Indian American community, which again, I mentioned is only about 1% of the population, but we think a really important slice, not only because it's fast growing, but also the Indian American community is a bit of an outlier. If you look at any standard metric of socioeconomic status, median household income, educational attainment, employment, Indian Americans rate off the charts. And so there's something very interesting going on with this community. And just as an aside, just given those statistics, many people would think that the Indian community would be big supporters of the Republican Party, given the Republican Party's emphasis on deregulation, on lower taxes, and so on and so forth. In fact, the Indian American community remains a steadfast votary of the Democratic Party, which is quite interesting, and we can get into why I think that is. When it comes to U.S.-India relations, I think there are a couple of ramifications. I think one is, I mentioned that since 2000, lawmakers across the aisle have placed a strategic bet on India. That is, in part because of the activism of the diaspora. Indian Americans have increasingly become politically mobilized, much more involved in the public policy and political realms. They are now prized campaign contributors. So in the previous 2020 Democratic primary, it was reported that Indian Americans actually donated more to Democratic candidates than Hollywood did. So we're talking about real money. We're seeing a growth in numbers of civic and community political organizations, people who run for local, state, and national office. So I think it has an impact. We did find that when it comes to election day, Indian Americans do not primarily vote on the basis of foreign policy or on the basis of US-India ties, but that's, in a way, to us, not that surprising, right? Because very few American voters vote on that basis. Most Americans, and Indian Americans are in line with this, vote on the basis of kitchen table issues. How's the economy doing? What about COVID? What about healthcare? What about the state of our education system, and so on and so forth? That doesn't mean that US-India ties are unimportant, but it may not be a defining electoral issue. So I think we're seeing a clear role in the community helping to bring these two countries together, but also serving as a kind of watchdog for when they believe US-India relations may be getting off the rails. And I'll give you an example. When India experienced this traumatic, awful second wave of the COVID pandemic earlier this year, the US government was actually pretty slow initially to respond with humanitarian aid, with oxygen, with medical equipment, and so on and so forth. And it really was the diaspora who spoke up and started to call their members of Congress, started to call their contacts of administration and say, you need to go online and see what's happening in India, because we're hearing from our friends and family on the ground, it's a dire situation. Now, would the US government eventually marshal the humanitarian response? Of course they would have. But I think the pace of that response was undoubtedly hastened by the activism of the community.
Okay, thank you. So those are some of the general patterns overall in terms of the political attitudes of the community, but also there is obviously differences within the community, right? Across different individuals about how they think about politics and different issues. So what can you tell us about that? So what would be some of the main differences within the community across different individuals and different political views, and what explains those differences?
Yeah, so, the Indian American community, like any immigrant community or any racial ethnic group, is not a monolith, right? It has the same generational, educational, age-based, differences and cleavages that we see in a lot of other groups. I would point out two or three in particular. Generally speaking, the Indian diaspora is quite bullish on the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi and the direction that he is taking the country. And that has not been without some controversy, right? There are concerns about democratic backsliding in India, about a new kind of Hindu majoritarianism, a shrinking amount of space for civil society and dissent. And we see this very clearly, this division within the Indian American community. If you look at young people, for instance, and people who are second generation, like myself, people who are born in this country, on average, people in those demographic groups are much more critical about the direction Modi has taken, much more likely to voice concern about his policies towards, say, India's minorities, namely its Muslim community. So in addition to age and demographics, I think religion has also become an increasingly polarizing factor. I think we see religious polarization happening in India, but the effects of that polarization are not restricted to the borders of India. What happens in India does seep into how the diaspora behaves. And so if you just look at differences, namely between Muslims and Hindus, in terms of how favorably they view India, how they view Modi, how they view, U.S. policies towards India, you get really night and day images. Muslims are much more pessimistic about where India is going, much more concerned about the rise of Hindu majoritarianism, would like the United States to speak out much more vociferously on questions of fundamental freedoms, of human rights and democracy, whereas Hindus are much more favorable about Modi. Again, it's a broad group, but so I'm just making average generalizations here in terms of what the data show us. And much happier with the fact that the U.S. appears to be putting the strategic logic of the relationship above concerns it might have about what's happening internally in India right now.
Okay, so we can continue to talk about diaspora, but given that you brought up this issue, so what do you think in terms of this issue of democracy and human rights in US-India ties? So recently there has been a meeting between Prime Minister Modi and the US President Biden and Vice President Harris. And there is a quote from her that it is imperative to defend democratic principles and institutions. So to what extent do you think this is an important factor in US-India ties, and in particular this issue of the treatment of religious minorities in India?
Well, I think, again, if you go back and try to unpack the sort of logic of US-India ties, right? I mentioned that there are several pillars. There is the strategic partnership, right? We want to promote our shared interests in the Indo-Pacific region. We want to work together on trade and investment, on strengthening the Indian economy. But another pillar that underpins US-India relations really is this commitment to shared values, shared, open, plural, democratic values. And I think it is that shared commitment which has now come under threat. I should mention that not only because of India's actions, to be quite honest with you, there are many in India who are concerned about the state of democracy in this country, in the United States, after the events of January 6th and some of the violence and polarization we're seeing. But if you leave that aside for a moment.
Sorry, so that quote actually refers to the need to defend democratic principles and institutions within our respective countries. So
and I think that U.S. policymakers now have adapted their language to reflect the fact that this is a shared challenge now. And also, I think India has been always very sensitive to outside critiques about its own domestic politics. So this is a way in which to frame this to show that, look, we're both in this together when it comes to fighting for democratic rights. What are the concerns that US policymakers have about democracy in India? I think if you boil them down, there are probably three. The number one, consolidation of a kind of Hindu majoritarian brand of politics. The second is the excessive concentration of power in the hands of the executive, namely the Prime Minister's office, and a general decay or deterioration in independent institutions and checks and balances. And then the third is a kind of clampdown on political dissent and on the media. And I do think that these things are getting more airtime. They are now talking points in discussions that US policymakers are having. But there's two quandaries I think US policymakers face. Number one is it's not really clear how much leverage the United States has if it wants to raise some of these issues with India. India is a very big country. We as in America would like India to do many things which we believe in our interests. And so, we're also tread very carefully. But the second is that, again, the larger relationship tends to be seen, people in the State Department, Defense Department, White House, through the larger dynamic of US-China competition, right? And we have essentially made India sort of the linchpin of what's been called the tilt towards Asia or the pivot towards Asia, or now this kind of Indo-Pacific strategy. And so I think we struggle to articulate our concerns. I think it's primarily done through rhetoric, statements like the vice president made, statements that other senior State Department officials will make when they're traveling to India or meeting with their Indian counterparts. But right now, we have not seen any domestic mobilization in policymaking circles to really go beyond the realm of rhetoric when it comes to concerns about democracy. Could that change? It could certainly change. I think right now, America's concerns with democratic backsliding in India have largely to do with the space between elections. Again, things like institutions, the judiciary, the rule of law, freedom of speech and expression. If we start to see backsliding in electoral terms, that there are questions being raised about the freeness or fairness of elections, I do think then that puts this quandary in a fundamentally different box where the US would likely try to say and do more.
Okay, so let's follow up again on some of the issues you brought up. So the rise of China again is a key development in the world and in international politics, and it is influencing US-India relations, right? So how would you say that the US and India tend to have a similar view regarding the rise of China and are likely to sort of cooperate in this regard, or do they have differences in terms of how they think of the rise of China and how this should be approached? And then what is sort of driving these similarities or these differences? So is the Indian perception of China driven primarily by sort of variables that the realist school of thought would emphasize, like the balance of power, or are the factors that are emphasized by some of the other theoretical perspectives like shared democratic values of key importance?
It's a great question. I would say that today we are seeing much closer strategic convergence between the United States and India vis-a-vis China than we have at any moment I can sort of remember. India has to walk a very fine line. It has an extensive border with China. It relies on China hugely for trade and investment. It is a relationship that, yes, is marked by competition and contestation, not least amongst their disputed border, right, in the Himalayan mountains, but also cooperation. And so it has been reluctant to take a very strong antagonistic anti-China direction in its policy. That is starting to change. Public sentiment towards China is extremely low right now in Delhi and throughout India. And it's not just because of the COVID-19 pandemic or not just because the border skirmish that we've seen play out over the last couple of years. I think it's a series of events and circumstances that basically have shown Indian elites that China, they believe, has fundamentally aggressive expansionist aims that seek to subjugate India and many of India's neighbors and many of India's partners. And so previous US administrations and Indian administrations would issue joint statements and communiques talking in general terms about we need to protect the freedom of navigation, we need to make sure that responsible stakeholders in the international community resolve their disputes peacefully. Now Indian policymakers are willing to make those statements and assign them a specific geography: the Indo-Pacific, the South China Sea, relations with particular Asian countries and neighbors. And I don't think that's just a rhetorical shift. I actually think that's a strategic shift. We started to see that under the Obama administration when Modi came to power. And I think we're seeing a ratcheting up of that now. And of course, in the United States, we too are fundamentally retooling our entire foreign policy infrastructure to deal with the China threat, right? I mean, one of the stated reasons President Biden gave for why pulling out of Afghanistan was so urgent was because we've got to focus on the threats and challenges that really matter. And number one on that list is China. So what's changed? I think China's own behavior has become more apparent. I think the Indian leadership, particularly Narendra Modi's leadership, is much more nationalistic. It is much more willing to have India play, as Modi puts it, not a balancing role in the global system, but a leading role in the global system. And so some of the hesitations India may have had in the past about being seen as too close to the United States, being seen as a proxy of the United States, I don't want to say that they have totally gone away, but they are definitely a much reduced than they have any time in the past that I can recall.
So you mentioned the U.S. Withdrawal from Afghanistan. So given that this is an area of strategic emphasis for India as well, can you tell us how the withdrawal is looked at in India and in general the issue of Afghanistan?
Well, I don't think you can find anyone in India to have say a positive word, frankly, about the way in which the U.S. withdrew, or really the fact of the U.S. withdrawal. I mean, I think many Indians had, frankly, a pretty unrealistic expectation that the United States would stay in Afghanistan forever, which suited India's interest because it helped to contain the nature of the problem. Obviously, now India faces this kind of strategic shock when you look at its neighborhood, right? With Pakistan gaining the upper hand in Afghanistan. Of course, Pakistani military and intelligence have supported the Taliban and other proxies in many ways. Many of those groups have directed their animosities towards India in the past and probably will continue to do so in the future. However, having said that, I think that most policymakers, officials in positions of power recognize that the United States was going to withdraw, that we were not going to stay there forever. They wish that it had not been as chaotic as it was and as abrupt as it was. I think now the focus really is on how can the United States and India work together to contain the threat of counterterrorism. And this actually dovetails pretty nicely with the general growth of U.S.-India defense ties, right? Where both sides have tried to work towards kind of moving away from a simple, okay, the United States builds fighter aircraft, we build drones, we build submarines, and we'll sell things to India, to actually, how can we think about a more collaborative approach? So what does that mean? It means now that we are working on modes of operation that facilitate interoperability, so our two militaries can work with one another and communicate with one another. There has been a pretty dramatic ramping up of intelligence sharing, and I expect that to be very important. I think it wasn't lost on a lot of people around the world that one of the first US officials to land in India after the fall of Kabul was Bill Burns, the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. But it also means that the United States and India are working together to co-produce and co-develop military technology. So for instance, there's a project underway right now to co-develop unmanned aerial vehicles, right? Basically drones. And so this is the kind of expanded engagement that I think we're going to see, but it's not only going to be between the US and India. I think it is going to bring in a much larger set of actors, including the Quad countries. We haven't talked much about the Quad, but those are Japan, the United States, Australia, and India. And in fact, the emergence of the Quad in some ways is one of the biggest success stories if you look at kind of recent US-India cooperation.
Okay, another thing I wanted to ask you is, in terms of the impact of the shift in the US from the Trump to the Biden administration, do you think that the US approach towards India has changed, or in what ways is there a different area of emphasis now by the Biden administration?
So I think you have to disaggregate that question into three parts.
Mm-hmm.
Sort of diplomacy, defense, and economics. On diplomacy, my colleague Ashley Tellis, who I work with at Carnegie, has this phrase, which I think is very apt, which is basically during the Trump administration, most countries around the world had a values holiday, right? Human rights and democracy were not, shall we say, at the forefront of the Trump administration's foreign policy. That's obviously changed. And so some of these comments about democracy that the vice president made and others have made, we did not see very much of during the Trump administration. So I think that is a shift. Now, what does it mean beyond rhetoric remains to be seen, right? Because as I mentioned before, right now we're in the realm only of making diplomatic statements, which have their own power, but obviously they have their own limits as well. When it comes to defense, I actually think very little has changed. If anything, the Trump administration picked up from the Obama administration, which picked up from the Bush administration, and Biden is continuing that. So deeper cooperation on a whole range of fronts. If you talk to people in the US government and you ask the question, who seems to be the happiest or most excited about where US-India relations are headed, it's the people in the defense establishment who would probably rank at the top. The economic component is a difficult story because there was not very much good news in the Trump administration on the economic front. Because the Trump administration, due to the president's own views, really put one issue above all others, and that is the fact that the United States carries a trade deficit, a bilateral trade deficit with India. And he didn't like that. And we know that he talked a lot about how we have a trade deficit with China, trade deficit with lots of other countries, but we have a much smaller, but still a trade deficit within India. And so that really curtailed the US-India trade relationship. The Trump administration revoked certain trade preferences that India had benefited from. We ramped up a lot of other disputes that we had with lack of market access for US exporters, domestic hikes and tariff increases and such in India. The Biden administration, I think, to be quite honest with you, shares some of those concerns, not so much the trade deficit, but they are worried about signs of protectionism, about signs of essentially propping up infant industry or picking national champions who might, with policies that will disadvantage, US-based companies. So I don't expect that we're going to go from 0 to 60 overnight, but I do think there is some willingness on the part of this administration to try and see if, rather than adding fuel to the fire, we can try to remove some of these irritants in the US-India trade relationship. Frankly speaking, if I look out and were to make a prediction, I don't think that's going to come in the short term. I think this administration's focus very much is on showing to the American people that they can deliver for the American people first and foremost. So the bills that are currently being debated in Congress about infrastructure, about spending, reconciliation, all of those debates, those really take precedence. It's really only until once those things are resolved that I think we'll start to see this administration pivot towards, okay, now what are we going to do with the rest of the world when it comes to trade and investment and economics?
Yeah, so given that you brought up these political economy issues, and this is one of your areas of expertise, so I was wondering, what is your take on the political economy reforms under Prime Minister Modi in India? How successful have they been?
It's a really, really hard question. And I think, there's a kind of the Jekyll and Hyde story, I guess you could say, right? The economist Arvind Subramanian, who's the former chief economic advisor to the government of India, talks about distinguishing between hardware and software. And by hardware, he means things like reforms that will improve and modernize, make more efficient India's banking sector. Changing rules and regulations that will allow for greater foreign direct investment into the country. Tackling things like the need to create a national bankruptcy code, which is something that India had never had before. Using digital forms of authentication as a way of delivering welfare benefits to the people. Modi has taken action on all of these fronts, not necessarily as quickly as some people would have liked, but I think he has accumulated quite a number of success stories over the past 7 or 8 years in that regard. And so generally, in terms of the investment climate and the ease of doing business, I think we have seen some improvements. These are a work in progress. By no means are these 100% successful or 100% implemented, but I think the intent has been there. Where Dr. Subramanian says India has fallen short, and I agree with him, is on the software, right? So when we come back to some of these political issues, right? When you talk about investment climate, it's not just about making sure you have the right laws on the books. It's making sure that you have a credible and independent judiciary. It's making sure that checks and balances on executive power through the parliament, through anti-corruption commissions, things like that work properly. we've seen all of these institutions hollowed out or subordinated to the executive, right? So I think that is ultimately a self-defeating strategy, because all of the good that one does on getting the hardware right is not going to have the right outcomes if you can't get the software right as well.
So institutional factors.
I think so. I mean, I think that's, if you were to ask me what are the biggest economic reforms India could undertake today, I don't actually think they're economic. I think they're first and foremost, they're institutional, right? They have to do with the judiciary. They have to do with the police. They have to do with the bureaucracy. They have to do with basic public goods delivery. Narendra Modi has made welfare a huge part of his overall reputation, but it has generally not been in the form of making sure that there is better provided health and education, for instance. It has tended more to the sort of public provision of private goods, making sure that people have electricity connections, making sure that people have cooking gas cylinders, making sure that people have toilets in their home. I don't mean to minimize those things. Those things are life-changing. They can be transformative, but they are not the same as providing public goods that can be accessed, by the general public. And I think that really is the next frontier, where we've seen relatively little action by this regime.
Okay, another issue I wanted to ask you about is climate change. So this was an issue that was emphasized by John Kerry when he visited India in September. So there was a launch of the Climate Action and Finance Mobilization Dialogue. So can you tell us a little bit about this, and what is your opinion more generally about how the US and India view how the issue of climate change should be approached? So is this likely to be an area of agreement between the two countries, or do you see that there's going to be disagreement about it?
So I think we've been a bit schizophrenic about this as a government in the United States, because we went from an administration under President Obama that where climate was absolutely at the forefront of all of their discussions with the Indian side. And during the negotiations leading up to the Paris Climate Accord, the president himself was personally involved in trying to get India to a deal. And the fact that India contributed positively to a deal in Paris rather than obstructing, which is a reputation that they had developed in previous climate change discussions, was actually a pretty big event. And I think India perhaps rightly feels that its contributions were not fairly recognized, which I think is a fair criticism. We went 180 degrees in the opposite direction than the Trump administration. Literally, documents had the word climate change stripped out of them because that was not a priority of that administration. Now we are back to an administration that looks a lot more ideologically closer to the Obama administration, and again, climate is at the top. So I think we've not been consistent, and that's set back our cooperation. But going forward, the Prime Minister has laid out a domestic goal of installing 450 gigawatts of renewable power by 2030. It's an ambitious goal. It's going to require financing for investments in renewable and storage capacity, in grid infrastructure, right? All of these things which are needed to guarantee that you're going to get clean, reliable power for, hundreds of millions of Indian households. What are the US and India doing together? So there's kind of a two-track approach right now. So the overall framing is, the US and India have a climate and energy agenda for 2030. Basically to try to figure out how do we institutionalize cooperation between the two countries to try and meet the goals that were set out in Paris. That in turn has two bits, right? So one is just working together on clean energy. How do we collaborate on power and energy efficiency, on things like renewables, emerging fuels, and so on and so forth. And then the second is the thing you referenced, which Secretary Kerry announced several weeks ago, which is a climate action and finance mobilization dialogue. That's quite a mouthful. And basically there is, trying to figure out how the US and India can collaborate on bilateral and multilateral climate action, including trying to mobilize major capital flows to help India reach this ambitious target of renewable energy, right? So that includes a US bilateral commitment, but it also means using America's diplomacy and statecraft to get others on board, right? So the Biden administration announced at the UN General Assembly in September that it was going to be doubling its climate finance contributions by the year 2024, which is, again, a significant reversal from the Trump administration. But globally, according to the United Nations, there is still quite a massive shortfall in terms of the $100 billion that was committed to earlier by the international community. So I would say this is a place of huge growth, huge potential. It is a domestic priority for India and a domestic priority for the United States. What we don't know is whether India is going to be even more ambitious. There are some people in India, including some members of Modi's own political party, who would like to see India make a commitment to net zero emissions by 2050. And that is not something the government has done. It believes it's already doing more than enough. And given that the United States and China and others have been historically the biggest emitters, they should be responsible for bigger reductions. So that politicking and diplomacy has yet to play out, but I suspect that negotiators are busily meeting behind the scenes right now in the run-up to the COP26 summit at the end of the month to see if they can push India to make a greater commitment.
So this then would be one area where there is a clear distinction between the different administrations, right, within the US.
Unquestionably.
Right. And what would you say about sort of the domestic perspectives on this issue within India? So are there debates there? Are those views evolving, or have they remained consistent over time?
Well, I don't think they remain consistent. I think the question is not, should India take ambitious action to address the challenge of climate change? I think the answer almost universally is yes. At the elite level, I should just say this is typically not an issue that the mass public talks a lot about. It's not there. It's very rarely an election campaign issue, but certainly in policy circles, I think there is that commitment. But then the question is, okay, so what does that mean? Does that mean that basically India should stick to the commitments it made at Paris and try to maybe over-deliver on its promises? Or should India really be a world leader in staking out a kind of net zero target and then trying to bring not just its 1.3 billion people along, but also other countries, by dint of its kind of moral authority or its leadership? That is where we have not seen a consensus form within the ruling establishment today.
Okay, so we are about reaching the point where we should be turning towards the audience questions. So let me look at some of the questions that we have in the Q&A. So one of our, we have several points about the impact of democracy on US-India ties, whether Prime Minister Modi will get an invitation to the Biden's proposed Global Democracy Summit, and whether the US may be turning towards Australia as a security partner. You have also mentioned the Quad as something we could be discussing more. So perhaps you can address some of these points that have to do with the role of democracy, international relations, and US-India ties.
Yeah, so I'm looking at the Q&A, so I'll try to, some of these cluster together, so I'll try to address a few of them. Mm-hmm. What is the value of a less democratic India as a US ally against China? I think that US policymakers are worried about this, right? I think that part of what gives this partnership some oomph or some momentum is the fact that there is this baseline of shared values. And if that starts to fray on either side, by the way, I think here the US needs to step up to the plate and admit its own fair share of shortcomings. That does take a lot of legitimacy and moral authority out of the argument that they're trying to make, right? Because it will be a major blow to the sales pitch, as it were, for global democracy. India has been a model since 1947 for how you can balance diversity in a democratic construct, right? And, you know, like the United States, is a multinational, multicultural nation, right? That is home to many different communities. And so in many ways, India, I think, has been really a beacon for much of the world, not just the developing world, but countries that struggle with how do we balance diversity and democracy. I think if it backslides on that commitment, I do think it will hurt the strategic argument and it will hurt the quality of US-India relations. You know, so there's a question about, has electoral backsliding happened already in terms of, I mentioned, it might be a red line if we started to see questions being raised about the freeness or fairness of Indian elections. I think it's a great question. In my own view is that we are potentially starting to see some of that. I'll give you one example is election finance. The Modi government has introduced new tools of campaign giving that is basically make completely legal unlimited sums of anonymous giving to political campaigns. And so it completely cuts against the grain of greater transparency, which is a trend India had been moving in incrementally, of course, gradually over the course of many years. We have seen the effects of that in reinforcing, in some sense, the dominance of the BJP. I do not think we have seen yet credible claims of, you know, vote rigging or essentially the kind of shenanigans you've seen in the United States about, you know, denying the basic legitimacy of an election because there was actual manipulation of tallies and so on and so forth. So I don't think that we've gotten to that point. Sorry, just going down a little bit more. I do think that the democracy message from Biden and from Harris was pretty strong and consistent. And I think it's worth pointing out that these messages are typically delivered privately, right? I don't think that there's any desire in Washington to embarrass the Indian leadership. They also know that public messages, you know, and sometimes they could be taken out of context, be more counterproductive, but it was telling that in her brief public appearance with the Prime Minister, that Vice President Harris did have an extended comment about the nature of democracy. Again, couching it as an issue that both countries need to work on. But I think that message was very clearly received in India. I don't know if there's anything else here, Nikola, that you've seen in the
Yeah, so a couple. Let me also just encourage everybody in the audience to ask questions in the Q&A. There was, so this question has been around for a while, but what do you think about the prospects of India getting a permanent seat in the UN Security Council?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I'm not an expert on the UN Security Council. I think the United States position is very clear, and they have consistently said now for many years that the United States welcomes an expanded Security Council in which India has a seat. Whether the global politics are going to align for that, I am very skeptical and very dubious as someone who's sitting in Washington looking at how hard it's been to reform less politicized institutions like the IMF and World Bank to make them more representative of emerging market countries. I don't have a lot of personal hope that that's going to happen anytime soon at the United Nations, but you know, hope springs eternal. I mean, I think leaving that question aside, I do think that the mindset of policymakers in Washington has changed. In the following way, which is that it is hard to think about a global issue now, whether it is terrorism, climate, pandemics, proliferation, you name it, in which India does not matter, and on which the United States is not consulting or working with India, right? I mean, when you read these joint statements that presidents and prime ministers make, they have a bit of an eye-rolling quality about them, right? Because it kind of reads like a laundry list, but underneath that is actually dedicated bureaucratic and diplomatic channels where people are working on everything from countering terrorism, what organizations need to be sanctioned by the UN that are engaged in terrorist activities, to how do we think about protecting against the next generation of cyber threats, to how do we think about a mission to Mars, right? I mean, these are all actually things that we do. And so that I think that reflects the fact that the default instinct now of US policymakers is to think about how to bring India into these questions rather than how do we keep them aside.
And what is the perspective in India on these issues, like reform of the IMF, World Bank, governance structures? Is that something that is an important issue that regarding India's ties with the US and in general?
Well, I mean, I don't think it's an issue that frankly gets a lot of play in the diplomatic relationship. I mean, it is there as a sort of talking point. And obviously under Modi, some of that talk has increased because, as I mentioned before, you know, India has often been rooted to this policy of non-alignment, right? And strategic autonomy, and really not wanting to get entangled in foreign affairs in a way that might distract it or detract from its developmental objectives at home. And I think this government in particular has maybe been a bit more forward-leaning in saying, no, actually, in order to achieve our domestic goals at home, we need to be more engaged, because whether it comes to technology transfer, whether it comes to financing, whether it comes to investment, whether it even comes to things like tourism, right? These are things that are vital for the Indian economy, for Indian development objectives. So I think the multilateral organizations are one small piece, but I think it's part of a broader conversation that is happening and is important to this government.
Okay, so we only have about 7 minutes left. So I wanted to give you an opportunity if there's something that I didn't ask you about that you would like to bring up or talk about more, or if you want to look over the questions in the Q&A and see if there's something you would like to take.
Let me look at some of the questions. There's something on the Quad. Let me say something about that.
Okay.
So I think, you know, there was a lot of attention paid to the bilateral visit between Prime Minister Modi and President Biden for obvious reasons. It's always a big deal when the heads of government meet. It was the first time these two men were meeting in person since Biden had come to power. Obviously, they had met when Biden was vice president. But I actually think the bilateral visit was really overshadowed by the first in-person meeting of the Quad leaders. That is the leaders of Japan, the United States, Australia, and India in Washington the day after that Modi and Biden met. And you know, I think this really does send a powerful signal to the world, but also to China, which is clearly one of the intended recipients of that message, even though China was never mentioned, I don't think, during the course of their deliberations, at least not publicly, as a way of basically saying, look, we need to band together in order to make sure that as far as the Indo-Pacific is concerned, we maintain the existing rules and norms of the kind of current international order, that we ensure things like freedom of navigation and trade. We promote connectivity, development, security within an existing framework of rules and standards, right? That it adheres to kind of democratic kind of principles. You know, this is something that I think is important and is starting to take shape. The Quad has been an idea which has been around since 2004, but it's really only in the past 3 years or 4 years that it's become a kind of concretized into something with a very clear agenda. In March, these 4 countries came together and made 3 big pledges. One is to collectively donate more than 1 billion doses of vaccines to the global vaccine facility known as COVAX. The second is to harmonize strategies of reducing carbon emissions by 2050. And the third was to cooperate together on what they call critical and emerging technologies. So things like cyber, things like 5G, blockchain, artificial intelligence, and so on and so forth. I actually think these initiatives are pretty significant. They haven't been without road bumps. I mean, India notably had to curb all exports of its vaccines after it was hit with this devastating second wave. So that right off the bat, the pledge of contributing 1 billion doses got off to a very slow start. India is now set to resume exports. When it comes to things like cooperation on how do we ensure that there's an adequate supply chain for semiconductors, right? Such that China does not corner the market. How do we think about working together on issues of climate change and kind of maritime security? I think these are really important, concrete, tangible issues that are worth highlighting. So it's not just a bilateral development. Obviously, it parallels what the U.S. and India are trying to do together, but it really brings in other partners. And I think we're starting to see initiatives that will build on top of this. So it'll be Quad plus other nations, or the US and Australia working, for instance, with the UK, as they've decided to do on submarines and so on and so forth. So this is, I think, a place to watch. Very last question here from Brian on the politics in India. Maybe I'll just say a word about this.
Please.
We haven't really mentioned anything other than the BJP and Narendra Modi. I don't think that's coincidental. We're frankly seeing a new era of Indian politics emerge in which we have essentially another dominant party system. We had a previous dominant party system that was rooted around the Congress Party. We now have a new dominant party system rooted around the BJP. The Congress Party is the only pan-Indian or national opposition party, really, to the BJP that can contest it in multiple parts of the country, as opposed to just a single state. It is a shell of its former self. It is suffering three simultaneous crises: one of kind of ideology, what does it stand for? Two, what is its leadership structure in taking on Modi? And number three, how is it going to develop the organization to do those things? In 2014, when Modi came to power with the first single party majority in 30 years, those three weaknesses of the Congress Party were on full display. The Congress had its worst electoral performance in its history, won just 44 seats in parliament out of a 543. 8 years later, not much has changed. If I had to look at those three factors, ideology, organization, leadership, the Congress has either stayed still or gotten worse. So that means that there is a very fragmented coalition, if you can even call it that, of opposition parties that have really struggled to come together, and they don't have a natural central gravitational force. And so if one is looking ahead at the next 5 years of Indian politics, I think you have to conclude that the BJP has the upper hand. It may lose state elections, it may lose local elections, there may be some anti-incumbency, but there may be some pushback. But on the national stage right now, I don't see an obvious peer competitor to the BJP. And I think that's compounding some of the problems we see, right? When you don't have sufficient electoral competition, accountability structures do tend to decline. That's not an India-specific comment. That's a global comment. And so, I think this current period is evidence of this.
Well, thank you so much. I think we are now about out of time. So thank you for telling us about your research and sharing your expertise with us on these very important questions.
Well, thank you so much for having me. And it was great questions, Nikola. Great questions from the audience. And thanks to all at UCF who made this possible.
Yes, thank you both so much for presenting such an informative discussion this afternoon. And thank you also to the viewers who joined us today. And if you'd like to hear more about future events at the India Center, please join our mailing list at theindiacenter.ucf.edu. Thank you and have a great afternoon, everyone.